Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I think there's probably going to be more people showing up as we get going. Thanks for coming out tonight for local foraging with Dawn Johnson. I'm Michaela, and I'm the adult program coordinator at the Pemberton Library. I'd like to thank Dawn for taking the time to come out this evening, or come out to sign on this evening, and share her expertise with us. I would just like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Lil'wat Nation, and the Pemberton Library is proud to be able to conduct business and serve the Lil'wat community and Stratliam communities and all people. Just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this session, so if you could just keep your cameras off and your mics muted just during the presentation, that would be great. And I will share the recording at the end or tomorrow, just in case there's anyone who missed out. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can just wait till the end and there will be a question and answer session with Dawn. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, any burning questions that you don't want to forget, you can just pop them in the chat there and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So I think that's it. I'm going to hand you guys over to Dawn.
Great, thanks, Michaela. Thanks for having me here this.
You're on mute.
Sorry, Dawn, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Oh, all right, let's do that over again. Sorry, I must have muted and unmuted. Yeah, so thanks to the library for having me here this evening. And I think it's great to continue all of these local talks, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to share my screen with you and we will go from there. All right. So can everybody see that there? I think so. I know you're all muted, so I'm gonna just go forward. So yeah, as Michaela was saying, we're joining you from the unceded traditional territory of Lil'wat Nation. And I wanted to share a little bit about who I am. And so my name is Dawn Johnson, and I wear a few different hats. In the foraging world, I like to pick mushrooms, plants, and I like to fish, and I'm also an avid gardener and beekeeper. My more formal background is in habitat restoration. I am a founding board member of the Stewardship Pemberton Society and the Sea to Sky Invasive Species Council. So that's going back a long time now. So with Stewardship Pemberton, we are, I think, 15 years or so in operation. So that is a great place to be coming from. And I just like to say that, you know, I've had some formal training with plants, but so much of my knowledge comes from learning from those around me. So, and also from the places that I visit and the forests that I get to spend time in. So who I am not, I am definitely not a herbalist, a botanist, an expert in pretty much anything. And I'm not a lot of other things, but so if you're here tonight to learn really specific knowledge about a plant, there's a lot of really great herbalists that are in the area. So I encourage you to reach out to them. So a little bit about why I forage. And really for me, this comes down to wellness. And when I say wellness for myself, it is physical, emotional, spiritual, and all of those things wrapped up into wellness. So it's not as much about sustenance as you might think, but it's about a lot of other things as well, as I'm sure it is for many of you on the call here tonight. So for me, it is a really lovely way to be able to bring nature into my home and all of my daily practices all year round. So if you join me for tea at any given time or pop over for a drink, sometimes it's an oxymel or a wild forage tea that we get to enjoy together. It also really helps me to cue into some of the things that are going on in nature. So for example, I like to take pictures of different species in bloom at different times of the year. And it allows you to go back into your phone and into your camera and pictures and see what was blooming when. And it's a way to really see the changes in the environment over time, and also sort of, plan and gauge what might be ready when. So for example, recently I was thinking, oh, it must be time to go pick that lobster mushroom that I'm always looking for, and can jump back into my photos and look and see when it was that I was picking last year. And for myself, every time that I'm out harvesting or foraging on the land, it really amplifies for me respect of traditional ecological knowledge that exists in our area. And we just really, there's such a great pool of knowledge here, and it's great to tap into that. And there's some really great resources that we'll talk about later. And another great benefit is that I get to drag my kids along, and friends as well, when we go on foraging adventures. So this lets me share my knowledge with them and sort of normalizes foraging and picking in their lives as well. I also really love to make self-care items for myself and for my family. And really, as I was saying earlier, it's about bringing plants and natural medicines into my daily life. And as many of you may feel as well, nature is always a friend. And so if you're having a bad day or having a hard time finding abundance in your life, then a walk in the forest is such a great remedy for that. And finally, sustenance. So this is really what got me into wild foraging to start with, was foraging for food. And at the start, it was actually just berries because I didn't grow up mushroom picking. And so I always liked to go with my family as a young kid and pick strawberries or choke cherries, huckleberries. And it really kind of spurred in me this lifelong love of foraging outside. And mushrooms, as I was saying, I got into a little bit later in life. But it's always so nice to look on your shelf and see some of the bounty that you've harvested throughout the year. And I just want to say that harvesting and foraging isn't just for hippies. And they estimate that upwards of 70% of pharmaceuticals these days are chemical compounds that are identified in plants or in other species, and then they're synthesized in the lab. So for thousands of years, people have been using willow bark as a natural pain relief medicine. And the chemical compound in that is found, are used synthetically synthesized, reproduced in the lab and used as aspirin, found in aspirin. Taxol is another really good example of that. And that's one of the main ingredients in chemotherapy. And that comes from the Pacific yew tree. Morphine is derived from poppies. And so, there's just, anywhere you look on the shelf in any pharmacy, you're going to actually see nature in a really disguised way. And it's always important to remember that, we talk a lot about how mushrooms can be poisonous or toxic, and people don't talk as much about how plants can be as well. But plants are really a powerful, can be powerful and sometimes poisonous also. So it's always good to remember to use safe practices, and make sure you know your plant ID. Have a really great resource, and don't forget that plants can be poisonous as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about foraging do's and don'ts as we as I think it's important to recognize. Never in parks. So this includes provincial parks or federal parks, Parks Canada. Unless you live on reserve, I don't forage on reserve. Or if you've been invited, then that's another thing. There's also in our area and all through Canada, traditional use areas. So it's important to know and recognize and respect those areas and stay out of there or ask permission to go. I tend to never harvest next to rail lines or next to roadsides because rail lines can be sprayed and roadsides can be having a lot of different toxins because of the exhaust from vehicles as well. So again, just know before you go. So if you're planning to go into an area and you're not sure if it's in a park, it's up to you to check and see. So a little bit more about traditional territory and land acknowledgement tying into that. So pretty much anywhere that you are in British Columbia, where you're on Crown land, you're on, or if you're anywhere in British Columbia, you're pretty much on traditional territory of somebody. So it's important to understand that, to know what that means and to respect that. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the stewardship principles and practices, and this pertains to plants. Mushrooms are a little bit of a different story because they're the fruiting body of the fungus. So with plants, it's, you want to assess an area before you go in and just look and see. So if there's, a patch of devil's club that's really abundant, then that's one thing. But if there's just a couple of different plants, then I would encourage you to move on to somewhere else. And never harvest any more than 5% of an individual patch. So you need to be assessing that as you go through. Some species are really prone to being over harvested. So for example, if you are thinking to go and harvest some roots or some bulbs, it's really easy to wipe out populations in any given area if you're not careful. So this sort of applies to all parts of the plant. So whether it be roots or stems, petals, that the petals are important flags for pollinators. So just keeping that in mind, that all of the parts of the plant have purposes for things other than us to harvest. And then finally, just know some of the reproductive properties of plants. And, for devil's club, for example, as we were talking about earlier, if you're out harvesting and you cut a piece of the stem or a piece of the root, you can actually take that and set it in some good soil and cover it up with some leaves and come back next year and you've got another plant that's growing as well. So a little bit too about biodiversity and threatened and endangered species. It's also important to know a little bit about the species that you're looking to go and harvest, and check if you're not sure. Most things you'll know if it's a common species and it's growing abundantly, then it's likely not threatened or endangered, but it's always good to check because things are changing rapidly. And then another practice that I like to use is never harvest something unless you're going to use it or be able to process it when you get home. And so these two mushrooms pictured here, the one on the left is chicken of the woods. And I was able to go on a hike with a friend this year and my daughter, and I've been looking for this mushroom for 20 years and I was so excited to see it. And we left it where it was because we weren't able to cook it that evening. So and this one on the right is bear's tooth, and same situation. I've harvested a lot of members of this family before, but this was the first time that I'd seen this species growing, and it would have been an awful, terrible mess by the time we got it back to the truck in our backpacks. So we left it where it was. So the only thing that I'll say about harvesting and making sure that you're careful in harvesting is I don't think that this applies to invasive species. And so I kind of consider harvesting invasive species almost an act of reciprocity or an act of restoration, because a lot of the times these invasive species, they don't have any natural predators. Invasive species are a big cause of the loss of biodiversity throughout the world. And so if you're out picking blackberries or St. John's wort petals to make an oil, I wouldn't be so worried about over harvesting there. It's also important to note that sometimes with invasive species, they can be sprayed. So just be aware of where you're harvesting. If it's in an urban area, I would be cautious. Or if it's, and if you're not sure, you can always check with the Sea to Sky Invasive Species Council here in our area to find out more. And finally, with invasive species, it's important to remember not to be a vector. So, you love these blackberries and you're thinking that you should plant a patch in your backyard here in Pemberton, but might not be the best idea, even though they're not really growing here yet. But with climate change, that could change everything. And just don't forget that gardens can also be a wild foraging place too. So with COVID, I planted a medicinal plant garden in our yard, and I included a bunch of native species. And really, it's a very, very, very convenient way to harvest plants from our area. And for me, I loved looking out and seeing the Nootka rose blooming in my backyard and realizing, okay, it's time to go harvest further afield. And so that's really great. And also remembering that native plants growing in gardens can benefit other species as well. So also this idea of being in a reciprocal relationship with nature. So we're having this talk in October, and the foraging season is coming to a bit of a close. And so right now in Pemberton, I'm mostly out looking for mushrooms with my friend Veronica here with a nice chanterelle we found just, I think, yesterday. On the bottom left there is that picture of the beautiful lobster mushroom that I found last year, and I had to go back on my phone and check, and I was like, oh, October 7th, okay. Make a note in the calendar to look again at that time of year. Pine mushroom up on the right, rose hip on the far left, and that I dry through the season, or dry, sorry, for the year, and use in teas and oxymels and other sorts like that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, on the top left there, right now you can forage conifer leaves or needles of any kind if you're just using them sort of not for eating. If you're not looking to eat just fresh spruce tips, you can harvest needles, conifer needles any time of year. So like us, nature's getting ready for her long sleep. And so foraging, like I say, slows down. And for me, it's the time of year to actually just really sit back and enjoy some of the fruits of the year's labor, because really harvesting happens probably, I'd say, for 9 months out of the year. And I love making gifts to give to friends and having things, sort of stacked up, ready to go. It just gives me so much joy to give those things to other people. So this is sort of a time for me where on a rainy fall weekend, I get to do some making. And then on my calendar, as it is right now, the next thing that I'll be looking to do in the late spring, sorry, that was my cat jumping into my screen. Late winter, early spring is harvest cottonwood buds. And I just simply place these buds in olive oil and let the jar sit out of the sun for about a month. And then I strain that oil off. It gets very sticky. Whatever you put it in, you'll never be able to use again for anything except for cottonwood buds, just a note. And I use that oil for salves and soaps and just straight oil, a body oil that you can use on a daily basis. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about processing techniques. So my favorite technique for most plants is just to allow them to dry in the air. Sometimes if they're a wetter plant, or it's been raining outside for days on end, and I want to dry some stinging nettle, for example, I'll put that in my dehydrator. I oftentimes put plants right into an oxymel, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is later on. Freeze berries for use through the winter. Some people do can wild berries as well, like make huckleberry jam and that kind of thing. My favorite way to preserve mushrooms is actually to cook them with a little bit of oil and salt and then freeze them. And then I have dabbled a little bit in fermenting different types of plants for use through the year as a way to preserve them and process them. So for me, really, I like to keep my plant material separate. So I have it sort of stored in these jars, plant by plant. And the one on the left there is Nootka rose petals, and it's my favorite plant to have on hand to add to teas or bath salts or into an oxymel. So you'll see actually on the bottom there, and I have my oxymels next to me so I can show you. I let my Zoom screen go away, but oh yeah, you can see now. So that's the oxymel made with the rose petals. And I like to keep things separate so that I can adjust teas and different products and make it really tailored through the course of the year. And so, oops, I also like to make a lot of self-care products. So I have made a lot of soaps. This one is made with the oil of cottonwood bud, which is antibacterial and antifungal and all sorts of good things. It smells really delicious. And if we were here, we could pass these things around so you could smell them. I like to make bath salts, and it gives me a lot of joy and pleasure to know that my kids are jumping into a fiery winter forest bath in the middle of December after they come home from skiing or something like that. And I also make all sorts of salves and toners. There's some really great resources for self-care products that I'll show you in just a moment. I make some elixirs, which is basically a way to preserve plant material in alcohol. You can also use some non-alcoholic methods for that. And I can show you where that is in just a moment. Yeah, and then in terms of resources, it's also really great to have a few books to get you started. So the book on the top right, The Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, that book has been my backpack companion. Oh, that one's the Northwest Coast that I have a picture of. This one's actually the one that comes with me all the time. This is coastal British Columbia for our area. And it's got a lot of really great information in here about plant ID, and also a little bit of information about traditional plant use as well. A really great resource for our area is Gifts of the Land by Luwat Nation. That will share some of that local traditional ecological knowledge that we talked about earlier. And there's a lot of different books like that exist in different parts of BC. So if you're joining us from somewhere else, check your local community and see what exists. This is a great book for Haida Gwaii, plants of Haida Gwaii. Yeah, and then this Wild Remedies book is a really great one that if you're interested in making different products for self-care, there's a lot of really great recipes in there as well. I also want to say that the library is just such a great place to check out books from all across BC, and they're really good at ordering things in. And they also have actually a lending library for that has a dehydrator, I noted, and also a canner and juicers as well. We talked a bit about knowledge keepers. There's lots of people with immense amount of knowledge here. And I have recently taken, for the last 2 years, I've been taking a course that I should say is only for women, but it's called 13 Moons with Natalie Russo. And it really allowed me to expand my plant knowledge, and every month a new plant is profiled. And so it's a good opportunity to take a deep dive into any given species. And then finally, last weekend was the Fungus Among Us. And for anybody that's really keen on mushrooming, that's a really great place to learn more. And then as well, sometimes it ends up that you have to buy some things. So, you know, whether I like adding other plants and other like plant allies into the teas and the things that I make. And so Stay Wild here locally is a great spot to find those ingredients. And Raven Song Seeds is a great place to order seeds if you're looking to plant a garden yourself. Harmonic Arts, Gaia Garden, Mountain Rose Herbs, those are all great places to order bulk herbs if you want to get started that way, because it's kind of a nice way if you're a little unsure about harvesting in the wild. It's a nice entry point to get to know a plant and then go and look for it in the wild. And the mother in me has to remember to tell, or always remembers to tell people to be safe. And so oftentimes when you're out foraging, you lose your sense of direction. You're really focused on finding, you know, that mushroom or that plant. And it's just important to just remember that, because it's important, obviously, to stay safe out on the land. For myself, I like to take my cell phone with me, and I have a great app that I use called All Trails, and it tracks you. And the one thing that I'll say is it uses up a lot of battery. So if you're planning on using any of those tracking apps when you're out, just remember to bring a spare charger, or to just make sure you're aware that it's using a lot of your battery power. And obviously your first aid kit and your emergency backpack. Tell somebody where you're going and when you're going to be back. All those good things that I'm sure everybody knows. So I thought I'd share with you and talk just a little bit about Oxymel, because I think that this might be my favorite thing to do with wild forage things that I bring in my front door. And Oxymel just translates from Greek as acid honey. And it's really a mixture of apple cider vinegar and honey. And it's typically 1-to-1, but I personally prefer 1.5 cups of apple cider vinegar to honey, and then 1 cup of plant material. And so the apple cider vinegar draws out the nutritional and medicinal properties of the plant that you're infusing. And then the honey has all sorts of other benefits as well. And so when I make an Oxymel, I let it sit for a month, and you always make sure to line your jar with a piece of parchment, because it can get the acid and the lid kind of react. And then, yeah, you just keep it in a closet or a cupboard for a month, give it a shake every day or two, and then strain it out. And it really keeps for a really long time. And this is an example of one that I've strained out, and it's a blackcurrant Oxymel that I made earlier in the summer. And then if we were all sitting together tonight at the library, I would close the evening by sharing some tea with you. but since we're on Zoom, I thought I'd share a recipe. And this is a really good one. And these 3 ingredients are on my annual harvest list. And as we were mentioning earlier, rose hip is something that I harvest at this time of year. You can harvest it even earlier in the year, and sometimes all the way through winter, actually. It persists on the branches. Yarrow, I typically like to harvest the flowering parts of the yarrow, but you can also use the leaves as well. And then elderflower, this is this beautiful flower that comes to us in the early spring from the red elderberry that grows in the valley. And you can collect and dry the elderflower, and you add it, you just 1 part of each to make a really nice immune boosting tea. So that is it for this evening. Thank you for listening for all of that. That feels like a lot of talking. So I am going to stop sharing the screen and open Zoom back up. Great. So if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Dawn. If anybody has any questions, they can take mute off. Just keep in mind that we are still recording, or you can pop them into the chat if you'd rather not be recorded.
I love that I'm seeing my sisters on this call. Hi, Ange. Joining me from the Caribou tonight, I think. This is the thing about Zoom. What do I do? What do you do with Devil's Club? So this is such a powerful plant. And for Devil's Club, I actually love making salves. And so in about August, I harvest the stems of Devil's Club, and there's an inner bark, and you have to be really careful because, as you probably all know, Devil's Club is very prickly, and those barbs actually can do some damage because they jump into your skin and it's hard to get them out. So you have to be careful in peeling the outer bark, and then I just take the inner bark comes off really easily, and I infuse that in a carrier oil. I always use olive oil just because I always have it on hand, and it's perfectly fine to use. And I let it sit for a month or longer, and then I make a salve out of it by adding a little bit of beeswax. So this is my this one's actually not this is my Devil's Club on here. I'll show you. And so it's this is one way I use Devil's Club. I like to, it's a bit running. I like to also use Devil's Club inner bark and pieces of the stem as a tea. And lots of people talk about the medicinal properties of Devil's Club. It's interesting, actually. I'm looking here to see if my friend Miho is on this call, but my friend Miho is from Japan, and it was interesting because where she lived in Japan, they have Devil's Club as well. And there they eat the early spring tips in tempura, and it's considered like a really strong springtime cleanser. Okay, Sarah, favorite local spots to forage. I think it really depends on what for and at what time of year. To be honest, I like to, if I'm foraging, I like to sometimes leave really natural, intact ecosystems be. There's a lot of really great foraging areas that don't require me to intrude into really natural spaces. So as long as it's like not really next to a road or a rail line, there's some really great places, like even behind Signal Hill, in the parcel next to the school there. There's some nice species in there. It's a great place for Nootka Rose to go look for some petals. Yeah, but it depends on what, and then, yeah, and then the time of year. If it's for things, it requires a bit of knowledge on what you're looking for as to where you're going to start looking as well. So if you're, say, for example, you're looking for cottonwood buds, then you have to kind of go and forage where they're found. Any other questions? You're welcome, Sarah. Right.
All right. Well, if nobody else has any more questions for Dawn, I think we'll wrap it up. I'm going to send out a follow-up email either tomorrow or Thursday with a link to the recording and just a survey. If everybody wouldn't mind taking 30 seconds to fill it out, that would be great. It'll just help with further future programming opportunities at the library. And I think that is it. Thank you so much, Dawn. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I agree, Vicki. It's too bad we're not in person. I'd make you all smell things like dried mushrooms.
We'll be doing more things in person, hopefully in the future. We're easing into it.
Yeah.
All right.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.